Today we are going to talk about agriculture NAMAs and MRV. This is a tricky topic as NAMAs are a relatively new concept, and the development of MRV is even newer and more undeveloped. So, to look over the content of the presentation, we are first going to discuss measuring, reporting, and verification, which is what MRV stands for, and a definition or the lack thereof for MRV. We'll look at some considerations from the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC. Then we'll look more specifically at MRV in agriculture and examine some of the technical challenges that are unique to MRV in the agriculture, forestry, and other land use sectors, AFOLU sectors. We'll then look briefly at the status of some of the MRV plans from countries, and then lastly at a couple of sample metrics that track and measure components of hypothetical NAMAs. So to begin, there are some considerations that the UNFCCC has given us. Back in the Copenhagen Accord, it was written that supported NAMAs will be subject to international measurement, reporting, and verification in accordance with guidelines. And later on, some guidelines were developed that were recently adopted in Warsaw. These domestic guidelines were intended to provide general, voluntary, pragmatic, non-prescriptive, non-intrusive, and country-driven guidance. And basically, they are very general guidelines. Developing country parties are simply encouraged to use existing domestic processes, and if they don't have any, then they may establish some. So we have very general guidelines. Some further considerations, as I mentioned, no methodologies have been officially developed for MRV. They have recommended that MRV could measure implementation status of NAMAs, of course greenhouse gas emissions reductions, and the sustainable development or co-benefits of NAMAs. MRV will also depend on sources of funding. Internationally supported NAMAs will be subject to a more stringent set of MRV requirements, possibly an international consultation and analysis process, and domestically supported NAMAs will not be subject to the same requirements. And so looking at what to measure, report, and verify, of course measuring everything from emissions reductions to the achievement of goals to the finance flows and levels of implementation achieved. Also reporting on what sectors, what activities have been ongoing, institutional arrangements, methodologies used, forms of finance, and the status of implementation. And of course there would be somebody designated in the plan to report through the biennial update reports, which are now required every 2 years by developing countries, also reporting to donors and to the national government. And then for verification, the implementation of quality assurance and quality control procedures must take place, and this will be true for both data providers and compilers. And so the purpose of the MRV system, well, it involves the collaboration of many sectoral bodies at different levels to check the effectiveness, basically, of these mitigation actions. But MRV systems also provide lessons learned and strengthen national greenhouse gas data quality. They also help identify national priorities, challenges, and future opportunities for NAMAs, and of course demonstrate emission reductions and NAMA impacts to donors. The MRV implementation plan would give specific answers on what, how, when, and who should report and measure. And these elements help to ensure transparency, consistency, comparability, completeness, and accuracy of information with regard to a whole host of aspects, including recognition and visibility of mitigation achievements, all the way to the creation of public and private finance. So MRV can help in a lot of different ways with a NAMA. Moving more specifically to the needs in agriculture, data is a very fundamental need for agricultural NAMAs. Countries in all regions consistently mention the lack of relevant data for the development of emissions baselines and subsequent NAMA MRV systems. More fundamentally in agriculture, there has been difficulty accessing activity data for agricultural inventory work and a lack of data to estimate emissions factors. So better documentation is needed for agricultural monitoring and evaluation systems, as well as a clarification of the linkage with the existing reporting systems. And countries should use, where possible, existing systems in order to reduce transaction and monitoring costs. These next 4 challenges were developed by the UNEP DTU, formerly UNEP Resource Center, and they are technical challenges that are unique to the AFOLU sectors. Number 1 is baselines and additionality. Given the ecological, social, and economic complexity of many agricultural landscapes, it is difficult to determine the right baseline and the greenhouse gas mitigation potential over time. Number 2 is heterogeneity. In agricultural landscapes, land use and soil type varies, so each landscape component will respond differently to management practices, which makes it hard to formulate a NAMA for an entire agricultural region. Challenge 3 is what they called a low signal to noise ratio. It's a particular challenge for soil carbon because of the magnitude of annual changes that's small compared to the size of existing carbon stocks. And number 4 is permanence, especially in forestry. AFOLU mitigation efforts require mechanisms to address the risk of events such as fire, disease, or human intervention causing a loss of carbon to the atmosphere. And as we can see, countries have started to tackle these problems, or the issue of MRV. Costa Rica is probably the most advanced. They have a livestock NAMA for which their MRV they hope will enable the generation of national emissions factors for methane and nitrous oxide. MRV data will enable the assessment of technological risks and the evaluation of 36 indicators that they've identified to help determine which are viable on farm. And I'm sure some of you have heard of the Costa Rican coffee NAMA. The MRV here will serve as a tool to improve national data. It will include the status of implementation by mills and farmers. And the interviews will be used during the pilot phases to assess the best methods for MRV data collection. Briefly, some other countries that have related through the NAMA registry what they will include on their MRV plans. We have Chile. Chile will include indicators related to biodiversity, gender equality, and adaptation issues. Mongolia will develop an MRV system that's based on a monitoring and evaluation system that's already in place. Kenya is developing its own Agri MRV system to bridge the gap between current agricultural monitoring and the national level cross-sectoral MRV. In the Philippines, they developed a standardized baseline for the rice sector using the CDM, but they will continue developing a more holistic MRV system for sustainable development and GHG mitigation. Vietnam will select one subsector for MRV pilot design, and Ethiopia's agroforestry NAMA will include MRV components such as vulnerability reduction, livelihood improvement, greenhouse gas emissions reduction, and MRV of activities against their indicators. So looking at our last couple of slides, we see sample metrics that track impacts on greenhouse gases and sustainable development. Our first example is for forestry. We have 6 components here: action, progress, greenhouse gases, economy, cost effectiveness, and sustainable development. So for forestry, you would have a scale up from pilot projects to policy. Your progress would possibly be counted with percentage of forest land protected, GHGs, CO2 sequestered annually, economy, incremental economic value compared to deforestation. Cost effectiveness would be cost per acre protected, and sustainable development would be the income levels near protected areas maintained or increased. And so applying these 6 metrics to an agricultural NAMA, say in the livestock sector, you would have a pilot, say 5% of farms scaled up to 75% of farms. Your progress would be additional carbon storage through rotational grazing, live fences, improvement in pasture, these types of methods. Greenhouse gases, methane emissions would be reduced from improved fertilization and decreased enteric fermentation. The economy side of things would be additional private sector alliances being forged. Cost effectiveness, increased livestock efficiency, and for sustainable development, we'd hope to have a strengthened producer capacity and increased livelihoods. So in conclusion, MRV is at the early stages in all sectors, but as we've seen, agriculture faces deeper challenges. MRV systems will vary from country to country. AFOLU sectors present unique challenges, and it's important to note that MRV knowledge and methodologies are not necessarily transferable from other sectors. Consistency with existing national processes, including the potential role of greenhouse gas inventories and sustainable development impacts, need to be investigated and clarified. And the very important last point, that governments should not allow the lack of international guidance and the as yet lessons learned thus far, the lack of lessons learned thus far in MRV to hinder their will and effort toward NAMA preparation and development, because we need to carry on in our preparation and development of agriculture NAMAs. And with that, I conclude. Thank you.